All right, take it away, Dave.
Hello, everybody. So today I wanted to talk about and demo XML injection. Um, and then I wanted to talk a little about, particularly for this vulnerability, external entity injection. So first, go to Swigger, the developer of Burp Suite. They have a very fantastic documentation and wonderful web academy where you can learn more about how burp works and how web vulnerabilities work. So to begin, XML injection. So this is a vulnerability that basically happens when the user input to send in an XML document is not handled in a proper way. And this allows you to use, what you can do is you can use XML meta characters to start modifying and changing the XML, and this results in interfering with the way the application works, or we can disclose sensitive data or other parts of the document. Particularly for this vulnerability that we're going to be looking at, we're talking about external entity injection. So what is that? It's a vulnerability when you can interfere with an application processing of XML data. Might help to dig a little bit more into XML, but for the purposes of this, we're going to just sort of assume that you understand that XML can be used to pass data objects back and forth on web applications, and it can be used for configuration files. Those are two common use cases that I know of. And so what it will allow you to do in this case is that we can view files on the application server and interact with the backend, or even interact with the application itself. We can then use it to escalate to compromise an underlying server or other backend infrastructure by doing some forging attacks. And so we can look at this a little bit more if we go to the site Hacktricks. And Hacktricks, right? So let's just do that, home, and then we'll do site Hacktricks. Do XML, XXE, and then so really quick, I'm just Googling specifically for XXE hack tricks, and they'll tell me a little bit more about what exactly is it going to do. So basically what we're going to end up doing is we end up modifying and changing the custom entities by modifying the document type definition. And this is what is used to declare the structure of an XML document and the other items inside of it. So let's start with that. So over here on Hack the Box, I'm connected up through what is known as Pwnbox. This is basically a Hack the Box VM that you can play with online. So here we have this web portal, and we can see that we can submit information. I've already submitted some of that information and captured it in Burp. And so if we look at the page source, we can see that it's calling two script resources, Bounty Log and jQuery mini.js. Let's first look at Bounty Log. So we see that it's doing some functions, and it's specifically expecting that every time it's being sent in, the request, the post, is coming in from this URL. And we see that it's processing some XML and doing some things with it. Very good. And then we can also see how we need to actually format that request and what it will look like. So let's go back into Burp now. So this is assuming that you have already spidered or used some other type of application to find all of the different resources on this site. So here, we did an input, we captured that, we looked at this, and then this is assuming that we did something like a dirbuster or gobuster to enumerate all the files that we can see on this URL. Well, we see that there's a database application here. Interesting. So that means that somewhere in here, when we send in this information, it probably gets processed into this database somehow. So let's see if we can interact with that. Why would we want to do that? Well, we can think right off the bat. Databases, usually the way that they work is that passwords are stored somehow in a configuration file that the database can have us access. And since we saw that this JavaScript is processing some things with XML, we think that maybe we can do some XML entity injection. Why do we think that? Because in this try catch block, we see that it's not doing anything to invalidate whether or not we can add additional elements within the XML tags. So that means we can start messing with it. So here we've gone ahead and we've used the embedded browser. We've turned the proxy intercept off. I do that because I'm lazy and I don't want to click the button each and every time. So see here, we've already captured one of the inputs, and this is the only one that we're really going to mess with. So we see that it does some data, and it does some things with the payload, and then it passes it over. So let's go ahead and let's just for sanity's sake, let's go ahead and send that to repeater. So now here in repeater, if we click send, we can start analyzing the different pieces that come back, right? We can see that it's doing some different things with the headers, it's doing some different things with the responses. Okay, so we've already captured some of that. So what we need to first understand is what's going on with this mess. Okay, well, you could spend some time looking at it, and what you would find is that if you highlight over it, burp will tell you. So what is happening is that it's doing some URL encoding, and then it's encoded in base 64, and then it passing it back across the line. So the HTTP message is actually a series of encoded statements that hold that data in place. Why is this important? So in burp, we can actually start modifying and messing with these as they come across the wire. So let's go ahead and do that. Ooh. Make sure my cursor works. So we'll do some URL decode, and then it says the next part is base 64. So again, I'll right click on it. I'll go to convert selection, and I'll go to base 64 decode. Boom, and there we go. Now we see that we actually have what that XML looks like, right? So now the first thing that we need to figure out is how are we going to send some data into this? Okay, so the way that we do that is here, right? And so how did I find all of that? Well, the way I found all of that is I first Googled around on the internet, followed along with what was in Hacktricks, followed along with what was in Burp Suite, and then I eventually came up with this method, right? So what's happening first is it's URL decoded. We URL decode it first, and then we base 64 decode, then we get the plain text. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to put some information in these XML tags and then package it all back up, right? So we'll base 64 encode and then URL encode, making sure to pay attention to special characters, and then we'll be able to send our data packet back over, right? And so what we see here, we can mess with the XML parameters because there's nothing in the try-catch block. We can see in the code that it pulls in XML data from the web packet, and then the XML data is sent to this specific URL or URI, right? So we have that all set up here, right? So we're doing a post to that tracker, derb PHP. And since we know it's PHP, that's going to come into play later on. If we went and Googled around, in this case, I'm using Parrot Security, we can actually look up some things about PHP, and we can find out that PHP actually allows us to send a lot of commands. In this case, we can send a file command, and if we know how deep in the directory it is, we can be able to find out some more about it. How could we do that? Well, we could actually just use an extension. In this case, we can use Wappalizer that's built into Firefox here, and it tells us that the operating system is Ubuntu, and it's running Apache. So if we go Google and look at the documentation, or if we just know because we played with Apache, we know how deep in the directory structure we would need to actually enumerate in order to look at what's in etc passwd, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll grab this, we'll package it up. We'll go ahead and convert the selection. We'll do base 64 encode. So now our string has changed. And we can look at the inspector side to make sure that we're matching everything up properly based on what we already think we know. So now we'll go to URL and then URL encode key characters. And now we'll send the packet across the line. Well, it didn't work. Okay, That's no big deal. Why didn't it work? Well, that's because if we look over here at what was in my strings, I wasn't actually formatting everything properly. I messed up and I didn't get the encoding quite right. And we can see that if we hover back over it through here. If you scroll down a little bit, see in this type, you're actually seeing that I didn't fully get all the URL encoding and all the base64 encoding done properly. So let's go back over here into a proper string where I've done it, and let's take a look at it. Why is that important? Well, because sometimes you can mess things up. So it's important for you to pay attention to that as you are trying to parse these payloads together in order to get them to work properly. So let's go base64 decode. And now we can see here. So what does end up happening? So we send in this doc type and we say replace. So where the entity hacked is, we'll do system and I do a file command. So we can do ampersand hacked here and close it with a semicolon, and then that's what it's going to end up replacing. So let's go ahead and try to get the encoding right. We got to make sure that we grab everything between the data tag. And let's go ahead and convert the selection. So we'll go base64 encode. That looks good. And then we'll convert the selection URL encode all key characters. And then let's send it across the line. Boom. And so that worked. Now, why did that work? Well, that worked because previously I didn't click the right button when I was doing the encoding, and I didn't grab everything within the data stream. So now we can see that, well, we can read the eds past WD. And so right off the bat, we're probably not going to know who the heck this guy is, right? We're not going to know his password, but we see that there's a development user. And how do we know that? Well, since we're good administrators, we know that UUID and GUIDs that are users go past this 999, and then they start to become 1000. So we know that we can log in there. Okay, that's great. But now we need to find their password. And so how are we going to do that? Well, the way that we're going to do that is here. So let's go ahead and convert this selection to base64 decode it, because this is a string I already did. We'll decode that and convert selection URL decode. Oops, looks like I screwed it up a little bit. Okay, no big deal. Why did we screw that up? Well, we screwed it up because I didn't clear everything right. And so what's important about that is that we took the notes. Why is it important to take good notes? Because if you're like me, you're going to screw things up. So Googling around and looking at hack tricks, we found that we can actually base64 encode our strings to go look at the database. Why would we want to do that? Well, I could spend a lot of time talking about that, but basically the whole idea is that looking at the source code of the application that we can see through the browser, we know that that's kind of what's happening as things are being passed across. So, and we can also know that because of the encoding and decoding that we had to do. So what does that mean? So that means that if we want to look at a file in something, we need to pass it through PHP. According to what PHP's documentation says, they have an option for you to do this base64 encode string. So that's exactly what we need to do. So let's go ahead and grab that, and we'll pass it back over here. Actually, yeah, we'll grab that one because that's the one that I worked before. Cool. And so let's go ahead and drop that in here. We'll delete. Great. And now that we've got that, let's make sure that we only grab the things after the data equals tag, and then we'll convert the selection. We'll do base64 encode, and then we'll do convert selection URL encode key characters, and then let's click send. Cool. And so that worked. And so what the thing's doing in here is it's actually encoding and decoding it in real time. So we should be able to see what's coming back in this title. So let's make sure that we grab everything that's in there. Oh, and it looked like we had it, but that's kind of the thing. You have to kind of click around sometimes until you can actually see everything that's being passed across. So let's go there. There we go. Cool. So now it decoded it. And now we can see that this guy is actually the database password, right? So we can see that what they're doing is they're passing it back and forth. So now that we know that that's the password, right? Well, now let's think back to what did we see when we enumerated the etc pass WD? We saw it was development. Okay, so now let's think a little about human nature, right? What normally happens with humans? Well, humans get lazy. So is it stand to reason that one of those users is going to be able to log in with this password? Yes. Could we spend a lot of time playing around with Hydra and seeing if we could hit all the accounts? Sure, we could, but let's just actually try to log in with this. So we'll go there, and that didn't work. Why didn't that work? Well, probably I didn't copy and paste it correctly. So I've already previously, I had copied and pasted the information because I like to take my notes, and I just use Sublime Text because it's super easy for me. And there we go. So now we've logged into this machine. Who am I? Who am I? There we go. I'm development, so I'm that user. And let's see what, now we would want to, first, now that we're on the system, obviously, who am I is not the command that we would send. If we were actually trying to think about being an actual red teamer and things like that, we might want to actually try to hide our history. But maybe we're trying to interact with somebody and we're trying to get them to understand. During the competition, you probably don't need to do things like clearing your history, but if we were actually doing a pen test, we might want to do that to give a real experience. So now that we're on the system, we could either do something like port over linpeas, which will tell us all of the permissions and things that we might be able to use to escalate. I just use sudo tac L, and now we can see that this user has a ability in the sudo path to not do a whole lot else other than run this application. So now thinking about the next stage of our attack, we would want to go and look up what's inside of that Python script, and then we would be able to run it. But what's interesting is that we should first try experimenting whether or not we can do anything with messing with the Python bin. We have access to that bin. Have they actually fully locked down that path? That's a challenge and something that we would need to look at and exercise later. So with that, that concludes my demo. Thank you, everybody. Candy, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it back over to you.
Okay, yeah, just some quick comments to wrap it up. So really good demo, Dave. Dave showed some common issues that when you're trying to do these kind of testing, some common errors, right, that are very common. For instance, the cut and paste, I run into that all the time, and he also showed some issues that when he was using Burp Suite, but then he showed you how he sort of fixed it, right? So that is sort of really important information that to help beginners, right, to have that information. That's really important. The other thing I wanted to comment before we conclude is that this kind of vulnerability, it's a very common pattern, right? So let's think about it conceptually. What's happening here, right? So according to the code or the mechanism of getting input from users who could be untrusted, is that in this case, there was not an ability to distinguish between just data versus data that's going to be interpreted as control characters, right? That will affect the control execution. And in this case, it was XML tags, right? So unknowingly, the application assumed that all the data that was going to be inputted to the application was just going to be data and not control characters that modifies the execution flow. And that's a super common vulnerability class that you'll see all over the place with all the other different classes of vulnerabilities. So that's something I wanted to comment on. And with that, I will end